And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable. Chapters is the television show that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are delighted to have Dr. Michael Woods as our guest here today on Chapters, and we're going to focus on the Antebellum period in American history and the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln and all things concerning that period of history. And Dr. Woods is a Seattle, Washington native. He is currently an assistant professor of history at Marshall University. He is a graduate of the University of South Carolina, where he earned his PhD in history. He also is a graduate of Whitman College, and he is married. He has a wife, Beth, and two wonderful kitty cats, and we are delighted to have him here. He's going to be talking about his book today, Emotional and Sectional Conflict in the Antebellum United States. And Dr. Woods, welcome to Chapters, and we're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you first, before we get into your writing and into your research and into your book, what brought you to West Virginia? What brought you to Marshall from South Carolina, and maybe even Seattle?
Sure. Well, there's always something a little bit random about the academic job market. Like most folks coming out of a PhD program, I applied very widely to a range of different colleges and universities. But I did end up with a choice between two positions that I was offered. And so I didn't just get shunted into Marshall because there wasn't anything else for me to do. And so, during my visit here, I enjoyed the community, and the department had made me feel very welcome, even as a job applicant. And so it seemed like a good place to make my new academic home.
Great, fantastic. That's terrific. Tell us a little bit about your book, Emotional and Sectional Conflict in the Antebellum United States. This came from your doctoral dissertation at South Carolina, correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in that topic, and where did the inspiration for writing that kind of a book or approaching that dissertation, where did that come from?
Sure. So I had gone to South Carolina to study the Antebellum period and the Civil War era generally. It was highly advised to me by my undergraduate advisor. So I moved all the way from Walla Walla, Washington to Columbia, South Carolina to do that. And when I got there, I had expressed an interest in that time period, and as I was looking around for a dissertation topic, this particular topic of studying emotion and political behavior came up during a seminar class during my very first semester, and someone kind of offhand said, "Oh, that would be a good dissertation topic for me." And at that point, I wasn't really thinking too in-depth about a particular topic yet, but it kind of stuck in the back of my mind as basically a new approach to an old question about what eventually drives secession and the outbreak of the Civil War, and how we might use a study of emotion to understand the way that people made decisions about aligning with a certain political movement or voting for a certain candidate or other kinds of choices. And so it kind of lodged in my mind, and as I talked about potential topics with my advisor, he thought it would fit with some of my background knowledge, my strengths in the area, as well as something that could be a genuinely new contribution to a relatively crowded field of study. And so that was how I got into it, and no regrets.
I want to ask you about the word antebellum. We hear that word used a lot in this period in American history. What does that word actually mean, and what are some of the symbols and motifs that word connotate antebellum?
Sure. So, literally it comes from Latin before the war. And in that sense, it's actually kind of a dangerous term to use, because the people living at that time didn't know that the war was coming. So it's only really in hindsight that we can apply the term to the era before the Civil War. And historians will disagree about what precisely, which years cover that era. I think most would settle on about 1830 to the outbreak of the war in 1861. So that's probably a rough guide. I think when people think about the time period, they tend to think about the South. There is an antebellum North, and I would, as a Westerner, point out there's an antebellum West as well. But I think that image, that adjective, tends to be used to describe the columned plantation home and the hoop skirts and some of the images that we associate with the South. But it could be used to describe any American topic during that time period.
So when we talk about the antebellum period, what years are we talking about primarily?
I would say about 1830 to 1861. My book focuses primarily on the 1850s, especially in the second half of it, where it really zeroes in on that decade, where you see a real increase in sectional conflict, and people start wondering if maybe a war might be on the horizon. But I always remind students that they don't know for sure that it's coming, so it's in some ways it's an anachronistic term for us to use.
I want to ask you also about the leaders, our presidents during this time. We certainly know a lot about Lincoln, and he was the president during the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of us have heard of that term and the role that played in the Civil War. But it was interesting in American history, we had such great, strong presidents from the founding of the country. We had the Thomas Jeffersons, the George Washingtons, the James Madisons, the John Adams, those kind of guys. And I know I probably got them out of order in terms of when they served, but we had those folks. Then we had Lincoln during the Civil War, but in between, we had some presidents that a lot of historians look at and view as some of our weaker presidents in American history. Guys like Franklin Pierce, Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan, guys who were involved in what happened from the time, really, of the War of 1812 up until the Civil War. What was going on in the country, or why did we have this big gap from such great presidents at the beginning up until Lincoln, and then we kind of had this mishmash of presidents in the middle that a lot of people don't even remember and are often regarded as not just ineffectual presidents, or ineffective presidents, but in some ways their decisions or lack thereof led us down the road to the Civil War.
This is something that people at the time were very conscious of. I mean, sometimes they lament the earlier generations. If only we had Andrew Jackson again, then we wouldn't be in this mess, or Washington. So we definitely, we're not alone in viewing it that way. There's a lot of one-term presidents during that time. And I think what it reflects is actually some of the divisiveness of politics during that time, where, the parties, and we're talking primarily the Democratic and the Whig parties at this time, are compelled to unite behind a candidate, but it's very difficult to do that. The parties themselves are torn between northern and southern wings, and there's a lot of factions within them, all competing for power, and so each one tends to have its own favorite son to run for president, and because they can't agree on any of them, they keep reaching for the Franklin Pierces and the James Buchanans as being sort of second-tier leaders, but at least the parties can agree on them. And so I think the voters at the time end up being presented with not the best statesmen of the era to choose from, because the parties aren't nominating them, and it's just impossible for them to agree on a higher caliber leader. So they like to pick war heroes, Zachary Taylor being an example, or folks who were so little known that they haven't offended anyone yet, and they can rally the party to some degree. Franklin Pierce being an example. Actually, he's a war hero too, so he kind of fits both.
And I know that in regards to Pierce and Fillmore, and to some degree Buchanan, even when Lincoln becomes president, they are still kind of in the background writing, they're in the background speaking about Lincoln and about what's going on in the country. I know Krista Rose just came out with a book not too long ago that dealt with that, sort of their role in the Civil War. So even though Lincoln, becomes president during this tumultuous time, he's still got the ex-presidents kind of lingering in the background. Can you talk about what that did, especially, not only in the 1850s, but as we get to the Civil War, kind of their backdoor kind of talking and speaking and writing, what that did, what that did to this movement in terms of creating more conflict?
Well, I mean, the most immediate connection is Buchanan, because Lincoln inherits the secession crisis from him, and this question, especially about what to do in Charleston, South Carolina at Fort Sumter, that tossed into his lap. I don't think he allowed some of the former presidents to influence him too much. I think he had enough on his plate with trying to keep his party together and to create some unity across party lines within the North. Buchanan spends a lot of this time working on his memoirs, trying to defend himself and to say, well, I really couldn't have done any better. But you also see some former presidents try to intervene right at the last minute on favor of compromise, of patching together some kind of compromise, and to lend their prestige as former presidents to some of these efforts right up until the war actually breaks out in April of 1861. And I think those are probably the efforts that Lincoln would have had to deal with the most directly, because he's very worried that, as he sees it, the North might make another bad set of bargains, basically to kind of bribe the Southern states into staying in the Union. And he keeps saying, we can't keep doing this indefinitely. So for the former presidents to lend their voices to that call for some kind of last-ditch compromise of 1861, that's probably the biggest threat as far as Lincoln is concerned.
You mentioned that a lot of your book takes place in the 1850s.
Yep.
What was the mood of the country during that period of the 1850s? As you mentioned, they don't know the Civil War is coming. We can look back on it, obviously, and know that it's coming. We can see the drum beats coming through Buchanan's presidency and some others. But what was the mood of the country, the attitude, the feel of the country in the 1850s?
Partly it would depend on who you asked, but I think there's genuine optimism, because we've just had the Compromise of 1850 that seems to have resolved some of the issues that came out of the 1840s.
And tell us a little bit about what that compromise was
Sure.
about.
So this compromise stems from the results of the Mexican War that finishes in 1848 and the conquest of a large amount of southwestern territory. And really the heart of the Compromise of 1850 is how to divide this up, what the status of slavery in these new states and territories will be, and what do we do with this immense chunk of land? There's about 500,000 square miles of it out there. And so this would be places like California, the modern-day states of Arizona, New Mexico. So we get a compromise then. Some of the area remains as territories, with slavery status being sort of left up to local voters. California comes into the Union as a free state. And it looks for a minute like this is it. There's no new territory to argue over. There's no new real call for secession after that. There had been kind of a secession scare in 1850, and that fizzles out. So politically, I think a lot of people feel quite optimistic. Economically, much of the decade looks better than the previous decade had. So it's a good time to be a cotton planter. It's a good time to be a textile manufacturer. It's a pretty good time to be a farmer, say in what they would have called the Northwest, places like Illinois and Iowa. And so I think there's an optimism there. But there's also, I think, a great deal of anxiety that they don't know that a war is coming, but some people fear the worst. And they can look to other republics in the New World, places like Mexico, places in South America, that have come out of independence very divided. They've recently won their independence from Spain. And there's this fear of, we've got to stay united, because the alternative is to have warlords roaming around and conflict at home. And so there is a sense of we've got to do better than that. And so I think underlying the optimism is a lot of anxiety.
And what was going on specifically in the South? Because we know the Civil War was fought over slavery, and there were such great divisions in the North and the South, both in not only just military means, but in economic means, and what Jefferson Davis and the South, when they get to the Civil War, the resources they had and their ability to fight on a northern front. But what was going on specifically in the South in terms of slavery and the economy in those states in the South? What are some of the issues they were grappling with there, specifically in the 1850s?
So in the Deep South, in the cotton states, kind of stretching from really South Carolina to eastern Texas, it's a pretty booming time. Cotton prices are high, prices for slaves are high, and they're actually rising. And so that gives you a sense of optimism, right? No one's going to make an investment in land or in slave labor unless they think it's going to pay off. So on the one hand, the cotton economy looks like it's doing great. And that seems to give a lot of the leaders there a lot of confidence that if they need to, they can make it as an independent republic, right? That they have cornered the market essentially on really the crop that drives the industrialized world at that time. They're kind of, it's almost like the oil titans of a later time period where they've got what everybody needs, and they think it gives them a lot of leverage over the North, but also over Britain and much of the rest of the industrialized world. Further north, the South's really starting to change. You're starting to see more manufacturing. You're starting to see more urbanization in places like Virginia, especially in what becomes West Virginia, places like Wheeling, but also along other stretches of the border, Baltimore, St. Louis. These places are starting to look a little bit more northern, and that's starting to make some of the plantation owners and some of the political leaders in the South a little bit nervous about how long they can count on those guys along the border to take their side. And so I think when you put those two things together, you really get a recipe for the Lower South to lead the secession movement, because they've got the confidence, they've got the prosperity, but they're also thinking long term, how long can we keep this up within the United States?
I know one of the things that your book emphasizes, and one of the reasons that you wrote the book, was to focus on the desire and understand how and why people make the political decisions that they do. And I think sometimes when we look at history and we look back at history, especially this period in American history, we forget that history is very human, and that there are real people just like us making these decisions, and oftentimes faced with very difficult circumstances, and certainly Abraham Lincoln is one of them. And I know you probably can't go through all of them, but who were some of the main players in the country during the 1850s, some of the main leaders, maybe in the North and the South, who are making these decisions, who are reading the tea leaves or the pulse of the people, as you've talked about, and are going to take us down that path to war? Who's involved at this time in this period?
Sure. So Lincoln is kind of a rising figure, but the Northern politician that really everybody has to keep first and foremost in their minds is Stephen Douglas. I mean, we remember him today as the guy who debated against Lincoln, if he's remembered at all. But in the 1850s, he's the nationally known figure. He's certainly the most important of the Northern Democrats. And he has really staked his career on the idea that continued compromise between the regions is possible, that he has the formula for that compromise, and that he can be a genuinely national candidate. Someone who can win votes in both regions, who can keep the Democratic Party united, who can appeal to just about everyone, and who can keep the peace. And he's really bet his career on his ability to do that. So everybody's got to watch out for him in the North. In the South, you've got a lot of different leaders kind of vying for power. John C. Calhoun, the most famous probably of the Old South leaders, died in 1850, and so there's this sense of kind of who will take the baton from him, and who will rise. And so you're seeing people like Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens in Georgia, James Henry Hammond in South Carolina. They're all kind of trying to be the next Calhoun who will keep the South united politically, but they don't agree with each other on how to do this. They don't agree on when the right moment for secession might be, or what kind of demands they might make before then. So there's a real search for unity within the South, but I think it's a much more divided place than a lot of its own leaders really wanted to admit or wanted it to be.
I wanted to ask you, too, about Jefferson Davis quickly. I know he was is today. I mean, historians look back at him in his role in the Civil War and being the president of the Southern Confederate States of America, with a variety of different opinions. I mean, as a person, he was quite terse, and he seemed like he was one of those kind of people that people either really loved him or they really hated him. And he sort of had an attitude and was sick a lot during his life, I know, especially when he was president during the South at this time. What are your thoughts on Davis and his role in everything that we go on? And I know that in the 1850s he was kind of emerging on the scene, but as you researched the book and as you researched him, and as we know eventually his role in the Civil War, what were your thoughts on him, and how do you see him now as one of these people making decisions that are going to impact the country?
I think Davis is a good reminder of how much power people like him, I mean, he's a cotton planter from Mississippi, how much people of that group, how much power they had at the federal level. I mean, we often think of them as kind of opponents of federal power, but in the 1850s they have a lot of it, and they like to keep it, and it's really Lincoln's election that signals that they might be losing it. So Davis, I mean, he enters the Senate in 1847, and he'll basically stay a senator from Mississippi, except when he's serving as Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. And so again, that gives him a lot of influence over Pierce's presidency. It gives him a lot of very direct role in military affairs in the 1850s. He's responsible for the experiment of importing camels to be used by the U.S. Army in the Southwest. So the camel experiment is kind of a Davis project. And so he's doing pretty well during that time. Physically, he's a wreck. His eyes are bad. He has searing pain in his head all the time. But politically, he does well. And it's really he's kind of one of the last to go. He kind of tries to slow down the secession movement a little bit to see if a deal can be made. He gives a tearful farewell to the Senate, and then joins the Confederacy, hoping to be a general. Kind of commandeer him into being the president. He'd like to be a military leader, with a military background, so West Point graduate. But I think he reminds us of really just how well the men of his station were doing until 1860, and then the very fateful election of that year.
I wanted to ask you also about your book. How long did it take you to research this book?
Well, I started the really serious kind of digging in the archives in early 2008, and had submitted a manuscript to Cambridge University Press in 2012. And then the book comes out in 2014 after some revision and rewriting. And so, I mean, it was a 6-year project, and I had good support to be able to do the travel that I needed to do to different libraries and archives, and the time to do it, which is really the precious resource of anybody who wants to write or research anything. And so I think that helped to speed up the process. I'm not sure it really could have been done any more quickly, but it certainly could have taken a lot longer to do.
Did you research it all first and then write, or did you research, write, stop, research more, and write? How did that process work?
More in the second that you suggested. I mean, there's a lot of pressure among kind of emerging scholars to present at conferences, to get articles out. So I was writing bits and pieces of it over time, and I had a fairly good idea about how the chapters would be organized after a couple of years of research. Obviously, these things change as the work goes on. But it was sort of an ongoing research and writing at the same time. And that's a little bit scary because you want to finish the research before you publish anything. But you could keep researching this topic for another career, an entire career. And so I think at some point you have to say, this is as much as I can do for right now. This is as good as I can make this chapter or this piece. And with the understanding that it's always a work in progress.
Why do you think today, scholars, historians, average people like me, why do you think we're still fascinated by the Civil War and this period in American history?
I still think it's not an exaggeration to call it the turning point of American history. I think it has the kind of drama that you don't get from a lot of other American wars of the 19th century, and people are drawn towards wars as decisive moments. I think the scale of the conflict and the scale of the death is still has a kind of a pull, and I don't mean to say that we're kind of being kind of bloodthirsty in being interested in it, but in terms of just the magnitude of the conflict, it's still unsurpassed.
This is what Peter S. Carmichael from Gettysburg College said about your book. He says, Michael Woods argues that emotions were critical in shaping the perpetual orientations and political action that ultimately severed antebellum America along sectional lines. His brilliant exploration of this subject has profound implications for how we understand Civil War America. When you hear comments like that about your book, how does that make you feel?
Well, especially coming from someone like Pete Carmichael. I mean, it's high praise from anyone, but especially for someone who's had the kind of career and still has the kind of career that he has. So, I mean, it's a good feeling, and especially for a revised dissertation. You write the first draft of it really to please the 4 people on the committee who are going to read it. And so to sort of pivot from that into writing a book that someone else who doesn't know me, who hasn't been thinking about this at all, might actually want to read, it makes it more difficult, I think, than writing a book that you know from day one exactly what the publication route is going to be. So at least I added a fifth person to the list of people who would sign off on it. But yeah, it's high praise, and it's very humbling, really.
One of the great things I liked about your book, and I've read bits and pieces of it, and I will finish it, but I've read some of it, is how you write. You take us through this journey in this time period, and the way you write, almost like it's narrative prose. I mean, it's not written like what some readers might think of a traditional social studies textbook or a history textbook maybe they had in high school or in another college course. But it's written almost like fiction, and you take us right there. I mean, we can see it, we can feel it, we are there with those people, we understand everything that's going on through the 1850s. Is that a writing style that you acquired through your years of school, or was that unique just to this type of a book?
I think this would have been an easy book to really load down with a lot of jargon and to make it very academic ease in the way that it's written, and so I probably tried extra hard to avoid that. Because it is a topic and it is something that I would hope that non-experts would read, and that's not always the case with a lot of academic history. And so I appreciate your comment. That's very good to hear. But I think I was extra careful just because I think it would have been easy to go really to the other end of the spectrum. There's also been a lot of very good writers who have written about the Civil War era. I mean, people still read Bruce Catton, even though his work is 60 years old. They still read Shelby Foote's work. And so I think there is a tradition of people who have written well about the time period. And I think because I think so much of how we write is shaped by what we read, I think that might have also, probably less consciously, but it also influenced me.
So my last question as we finish up, or my next to last question as we finish up, what are you working on now, or what is the next book you have in mind, and have you started researching and writing it?
I have. I'm working now, and actually both of these guys have come up, but I'm trying to write a kind of a joint biography of Stephen Douglas and Jefferson Davis. They are both on the frontier in the 1830s, or what to them is the frontier in Illinois and Mississippi, and then they rise to leadership within the Democratic Party in the 1840s and 50s. And so their careers are very nicely parallel. And what's coming in 1860 is their party fragments apart. They can't agree on a candidate. They actually field two Democratic candidates that year, Douglas being one of them. And this really sets the stage for Lincoln's election. And so I'm interested in these two men, but I'm also interested in using their lives and their careers to understand what leads to that really fateful split in 1860 that signals to a lot of people that a crisis is very much at hand. And I think by doing it through a biographical lens, it'll again tend to humanize the story, and we can see it through Davis and Douglas's eyes. So I've been spending a lot of time reading their mail, and I mean that's the way that we tend to operate, is to know, okay, well, what did they know at what time? You know, who's sending them advice from back at home or from other states, and how are they trying to make decisions in response to it?
Any advice you would give someone thinking about writing nonfiction, or writing about this period in history, or writing about some of these figures that we've heard about? If they're thinking about doing this, maybe they're going into an MA program, they want to think about a PhD program, any advice you could give to them about research and writing this kind of work?
I would say that it's known for being a very crowded field. There's been a lot written. It's one of the most written about time periods in human history. But I would suggest not to be intimidated by that, because I think there's always something new to say. And so you might have to work a little bit harder to prove that it's new, or to prove that you're not just rehashing something that's been done before. But I think it's worth it, because I think there's still a lot that's left undone. So I would say the best advice is to be sensible, but go for it. And then it probably will be new.
In our final moments here, Michael, if one of our audience members wants to get in contact with you to learn more about your book, or to talk to you more about this period in history, or find out what you've got going on in terms of research and writing, how's it best for them to get in contact with you?
Well, they can visit the Marshall University History Department webpage. I've got a little profile on there. There's an email address and an office phone number listed there. And there's also a link where they can go to a more personalized website that has more information about what I published and what I teach and things like that.
Dr. Michael Woods has been our guest here today on Chapters. He's the author of the fantastic book, Emotional and Sectional Conflict in the Antebellum United States. And for any of our audience who is fascinated by this period in American history and would like to learn more about what was going on in the 1850s, I encourage them to read your book. It's a fascinating contribution, I think, to this period in history. Congratulations on its publication, and we appreciate you joining us. And as you get that next book written on Stephen Douglas and Jefferson Davis, we'll definitely have you back on to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And our broadcasts of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable are not possible without the support and the assistance of the staff and management at Empire Books and News here at Pullman Square in Huntington. We appreciate them not only providing our studio taping space today, but for all their support both behind the scenes and in front of the camera to make our Chapters broadcast possible. We encourage you to stop by Empire Books and News for any of your reading needs. Talk to Charlotte and her staff, and they can get you taken care of right here at Empire Books. And if you've got a question or comment about this Chapters program, or maybe any Chapters program you've seen here on Armstrong Cable, we want to hear from you. You can send us an email to the address right there at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We appreciate all the feedback and comments that we receive, so please keep them coming. And if you want to go back and check out a previous episode of Chapters, we've made that possible for you by a link through YouTube and the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube. All you need to do is go to the address that's also emerged here at the bottom of the screen, www.youtube.com/Armstrong One Wire. From there you can find all of our interviews with the authors, publishers, and editors of the region. Go back and see them again for a second or third time, and we know many of you have, and we appreciate that. But we've got over 11 hours of author interviews, editor interviews, and publisher interviews posted there for you to take a look at. So that's available through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube. So we hope you'll check that out, and we encourage you to do so. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters. Please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.